Hey everybody, Onan here. So, trying to record this in the car, so I apologize if the audio isn't as good or if there's a little bit of background noise. Um, so today I wanted to talk about what I see as a disconnect between traditional teleology and how sort of Thomistic um, moral theory seems to be at odds, at least when it comes to marriage, with the person and the purpose of the relationship. So when we get married, we take some rather simple vows, and, to be faithful. It's going to be for the rest of our life, and rich and poor, and sickness and health, and all that good stuff. Um, and and there is a vow that we take to be open to life, to welcome children lovingly from God, and to raise them in the faith, something along those lines. That's the extent of the vows that we take as Catholics with respect to procreation. There's nothing in the marriage vows that says, you will always, you know, engage in the conjugal act a certain way, or respect the integrity of the conjugal act, or whatever. Um, and if you go back to, I think it's the Council of Trent and the Catechism of Trent from, like, what, the 1600s, you know, it identifies, I believe, three purposes of marriage. Number one, companionship of the spouses. Number two, procreation of children. Number three, I think, um, like satisfying concupiscence, or whatever, trying to hold off lust, something along those lines. And the Catholics, the Church's theology and all this has certainly developed since then, but that, in terms of infallible teaching, that represents kind of, I think, the most straightforward, infallible concept of marriage. Nothing in there, of course, about contraception or the conjugal act or how it must be used or anything like that. And but what has happened, if you really look at any kind of discourse or dialogue on contraception and sexual sins and licit and illicit, um, other than, like, let's say, adultery and fornication, which are, based on violations of a relationship, right? They're based on violations of the marriage relationship and one's duty to your spouse. But now we're talking about how validly married, sacramentally married spouses interact with each other within the context of marriage itself. It's not it's not a matter of fornication. It's not a matter of adultery, despite what, let's say, the Christopher West of the world might argue that any deviation from how the conjugal act is supposed to be used is fornication. But I think traditionally fornication is sex before you're married, and adultery is sex outside of marriage once you're married. It doesn't really make sense to lump activities within the marriage between validly married spouses as fornication and adultery. At least I don't think so. And so out of that has developed this teleology, this kind of, we can we can know the purpose of certain things and certain body parts and certain bodily functions by looking at them, also called, let's say, natural law, and draw conclusions from that about how people should and shouldn't use it. And that's where most of the church's teaching, or at least um, purported authorities in the church, their teaching on things like contraception, masturbation, um, that kind of stuff comes from, right? Well, here's where I think the fundamental problem is, because they they contend that the conjugal act must be used in a certain way. It must maintain the procreative and unitive purposes. And if you go a little further back and you sort of follow the John Farrells of the world, it's procreation must be the primary intent of the conjugal act, primary purpose. So, okay, but how do we get? Let's just assume that's all true. Let's assume the conjugal act, when used, must maintain those two ends. So you must maintain the procreative possibility and the unitive possibility, and from that conclude that, among other things, contraception as part of the conjugal act is improper. And if you really want to get Old Testament style, let's say pulling out, where you're engaging in the conjugal act, but then you are thwarting the procreative purpose. um, but what about what? Why is that though? Because, in my opinion, a simpler analysis is a couple morally obligated at this moment to engage in the conjugal act and or try to make a baby, right? If a couple is morally obligated for some reason to try to make a baby right now, then any any let's say failure to engage in the conjugal act or use of the conjugal act in a way that, let's say, thwarts its procreative potential is a problem, right? Because it's not that it's violating the integrity of the act, it's violating the couple's duty at that point in time to try to make a baby. And that makes some sense. If there was such a duty, it would make some sense that you can't either refrain from engaging in the conjugal act, or you can't use it in a way that thwarts the purpose you're trying to accomplish here, which is to fulfill that duty to procreate. But what if there isn't a duty to procreate at a particular time? Um, what if a couple is within their moral right to not engage in the conjugal act at all? If you want to employ the grave reason standard under Humani Vitae or some other standard, I mean, even John Farrell says there's never actually a duty to procreate. So a couple could, I think, according to him, in good conscience, just be completely continent and never try to make babies, which I don't know how you square that with the vows that we take in our wedding, but that's what he contends. So he contends, well, there's never actually a duty to procreate, but if you're going to engage in the conjugal act, it has to be done a certain way. Or if you're going to engage in it all, it must always be oriented towards procreation, I think is what he would say. But if we take for granted that there isn't necessarily a duty, or there can be circumstances where a couple is not under a duty to try and make a baby, why is it that they can't make use of the conjugal act in a non-procreative way, or something other than the conjugal act, other acts, solo acts, whatever? Because if they're not under a duty to actually engage in a procreative conjugal act, what exactly is the problem with them engaging in some lesser form of that, which is, by all accounts, harmless, and number two, helpful, provides some benefit to the marriage, to the relationship, that abstinence simply does not do? How can there be, how can it be immoral to engage in some alternative or lesser version of the conjugal act if there isn't actually a moral duty to engage in the conjugal act, the full conjugal act, at this moment in time? How do you get there? Well, the way I see they get there is they essentially put moral value on the conjugal act itself, that you cannot violate the integrity of the conjugal act, irrespective of the persons themselves, the relationship, the circumstances, whether they have a duty to procreate, how many children they have. Like it, it in many ways uh, delegates or relegates the spouses and the marriage itself below the act itself, which the act itself is supposed to serve the marriage, not the other way around. So now they have marriage serving the couple, serving the act itself, which they attribute some moral value to in and of itself. I mean, that's essentially what's happening. That's the only way you could say that a couple is sinning, by engaging in some lesser version of the conjugal act or lesser use of the sexual faculties under circumstances where they're not under a duty to do anything at all. And so how can that be? How can an act, a function of the body, of an individual's body or a couple's body, how can it gain a status, a moral status, above and beyond and irrespective of the good of the individual and the relationship itself? That is the problem. That is the problem, is that it elevates an act or the function of the body above and beyond the person and or the relationship itself. And that, I think, is a fundamental problem in how the church has traditionally approached sexual morality within marriage. Because again, you can deal with sexual morality outside of marriage through, adultery, fornication. It doesn't matter whether they engage in an act open to life or not. If you're not married, that's fornication, right? Or if you engage in the correct conjugal act with someone other than your spouse, that's adultery. It's wrong because it's adultery, not. Or if you would engage in a contraceptive act with someone other than your spouse, it's wrong essentially because you're violating your marriage vows, not because the act itself is somehow improper. That makes no sense at all. So how how we can put such high moral consequences on acts, irrespective of the individuals involved in the act or the relationship or the purpose that that act is supposed to serve, the relationship itself. I don't know how or why we do that. And I don't know if there's any way to untether ourselves from that, but as long as that's the framework we use, and as long as we're trying to continue to fit that odd framework into ongoing theology of the body or whatever, you're going to have these just sort of irrational applications, and you're going to have these rules that don't seem to make any sense at all, don't seem to provide any benefit to the marriage, and in fact do nothing but cause difficulty and hardship. That is that is the problem with sort of teleology and looking at the morality of things from the standpoint of the act itself as opposed to the individuals involved and the relationship they had. So anyway, I wanted to throw that out there. I know that's probably a very, very butchered articulation of teleology, but as a simple man with a decent mind, that's how I look at it. And I don't know. Again, it's frustrating because it seems, just staring at it, to make no logical sense the way we approach it now. And I'd like maybe some good explanation for why my approach to it isn't actually the right one. So anyway, wanted to throw that out there to you guys. Appreciate your comments and feedback one way or another. Otherwise, appreciate you watching. and listening. And until next time, everyone, have a good one.